Hey guys, tonight we're diving into some of the most dangerous cursed artifacts of the medieval world. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how many history lovers and people avoiding sleep for questionable reasons gather here from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If there was one object capable of making medieval rulers completely abandon common sense, it was a crown. Not just any crown, of course. This was the Iron Crown of Lombardy, one of the most famous and feared royal artifacts in medieval Europe. Unlike ordinary crowns covered in enough gold to bankrupt a small kingdom, this one carried a far more valuable asset, a legendary origin story. According to tradition, the thin iron band hidden inside the crown had been forged from one of the nails used during the crucifixion of Christ. Whether that story was true is difficult to prove. Whether people believed it is much easier to answer. Absolutely. And once medieval people believed something, they committed to it with impressive determination. This was, after all, an age where a failed harvest, a comet, and an unusually aggressive goat could all be interpreted as divine messages. The crown quickly became one of the most sacred symbols of authority in Europe. Kings wanted it. Emperors wanted it. Ambitious nobles wanted it. Popes wanted influence over whoever possessed it. In short, everyone wanted the crown except the people who had to guard it. To be crowned with the Iron Crown meant more than becoming a ruler. It suggested that heaven itself approved of your reign. Unfortunately, heaven seemed strangely reluctant to provide customer support afterward. Over the centuries, ruler after ruler sought possession of the crown. Many of them soon encountered disasters that chroniclers eagerly connected to the artifact. Some died unexpectedly, some faced rebellions, some lost wars. Others discovered that governing medieval Europe was like attempting to herd angry cats, while your neighbours repeatedly set your barn on fire. Naturally, the crown began attracting rumours. Whispers spread that it carried a curse. The pattern appeared difficult to ignore. Powerful men fought desperately to obtain the artifact, only to find themselves facing endless misfortune once they had it. One famous admirer was Charlemagne, whose empire stretched across much of Western Europe. During his lifetime, he appeared unstoppable. Yet after his death, his vast empire slowly fragmented into competing kingdoms ruled by descendants who often seemed to regard family reunions as opportunities for civil war. Medieval storytellers looked at this situation and reached a conclusion. Clearly the crown was cursed. The possibility that dividing a massive empire among ambitious heirs might create problems received considerably less attention. As centuries passed, Holy Roman emperors continued travelling into Italy to claim the crown. Many arrived expecting glory. Instead, they found Italian politics. This was unfortunate. Italian cities rebelled, noble families plotted, allies changed sides. Assassinations occurred with alarming frequency. Trust was often treated as a temporary condition rather than a permanent virtue. For many rulers, obtaining the crown turned out to be the easiest part of the entire process. Keeping the throne was where the suffering began, and this is what made the Iron Crown such a perfect cursed artifact. Whenever a king won a victory, everyone praised his wisdom. Whenever he suffered a humiliating defeat, lost half his territory, and accidentally started 3 new wars, people glanced suspiciously at the crown. The artifact enjoyed perhaps the greatest arrangement in medieval history. It received all the credit for success, and none of the responsibility for failure. By the late Middle Ages, the Iron Crown had become far more than a royal treasure. It was a symbol of ambition itself, an object that promised legitimacy, glory, and divine favour. Yet nearly everyone who pursued those rewards discovered the same uncomfortable truth. The crown did not create power. It simply attracted people who wanted too much of it. And if there was a curse hidden within the Iron Crown of Lombardy, it may not have been supernatural at all. The real curse was convincing generations of rulers that one more crown would finally solve all their problems. History suggests it mostly gave them new ones. If medieval Europe had one universal rule, it was this. Whenever a mysterious gemstone appeared, somebody would eventually decide it was cursed. The Emerald of St. Mark was one such treasure. According to legend, this remarkable green stone found its way into the vast collection of relics and treasures held by Venice. Over time, stories emerged claiming that the emerald had an ancient and troubling history. Some whispered that it had once belonged to pagan priests. Others insisted it came from a forgotten temple somewhere in the east. A few storytellers, never satisfied with ordinary explanations, claimed demons themselves had guarded it before humans acquired it. As usual, nobody could agree on the details. The curse, however, was easier to agree upon. Venice during the Middle Ages was one of the richest cities on earth. Merchant ships arrived daily carrying silk, spices, gold, jewels, and enough luxury goods to make the average European peasant wonder whether they were living on the same planet. The city became fabulously wealthy. It also became fabulously paranoid. When fortunes were won and lost overnight, people constantly searched for explanations. If a merchant suddenly became rich, God had blessed him. If he suddenly lost everything, perhaps a curse was involved. The emerald became connected to a surprising number of unfortunate events. A merchant family suffered financial collapse. The emerald was blamed. A nobleman's ships vanished during a storm. The emerald was blamed. A political rival died unexpectedly. The emerald was blamed. A seagull stole someone's lunch near the harbour. Given enough time, the emerald probably would have been blamed for that too. The gemstone's reputation grew stronger with every new story. Some claimed that owners experienced vivid nightmares after spending time near it. Others reported feelings of dread, anxiety, or unexplained illness. Of course, many wealthy Venetians were already surrounded by enemies, political intrigue, and business competitors who would happily ruin them for a modest profit. Such circumstances can occasionally produce anxiety without supernatural assistance. Yet the legends persisted. Part of the emerald's power came from its mystery. Nobody could fully explain where it had come from. The less people knew, the more imagination filled the gaps. And medieval imaginations were remarkably productive. This was the same era that occasionally solved unanswered questions by adding dragons. The truth is that Venice itself may have been the real curse. The city was a place of endless ambition. Merchants gambled fortunes. Politicians plotted constantly. Rivals watched one another with suspicion. Wealth brought influence, but influence attracted enemies. The emerald simply became a convenient symbol for all those dangers. Yet for centuries, people continued telling stories about the mysterious green stone. Because a cursed emerald is far more interesting than admitting that greed, jealousy, and politics were usually responsible for most disasters. And unlike cursed gemstones, those problems never went out of fashion. Few medieval artifacts inspired more fascination, fear, and outright obsession than the legendary Spear of Destiny. According to tradition, this was the very spear used by the Roman soldier Longinus to pierce the side of Christ during the crucifixion. If true, it would have been one of the most important relics in Christianity. If not true, it was still one of the most successful pieces of medieval marketing ever created. Over the centuries, various rulers claimed to possess the spear. Each version came with impressive documentation, passionate defenders, and just enough mystery to keep arguments going for generations. And where there is mystery, a curse is rarely far behind. By the early Middle Ages, many believed the spear granted divine protection to whoever possessed it. Kings and emperors treated it as more than a relic. It was a symbol of legitimacy, power, and heavenly approval. The logic was simple. Own the spear, and God favours you. Lose the spear, and things may become complicated. Very complicated. One of the most famous owners was the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I. He carried the relic into battle and won spectacular victories. Chroniclers pointed to the spear as proof of divine support. Naturally, when rulers succeeded, the spear received credit. When rulers failed, explanations became more creative. As generations passed, stories accumulated. Some claimed no owner could be defeated while holding the spear. Others insisted disaster would strike the moment it left their possession. The problem was that history stubbornly refused to cooperate with these theories. Many rulers who possessed the spear still faced rebellions. They still lost battles. They still died. Quite a few discovered that owning a sacred relic did not prevent their relatives from plotting against them. This was an unfortunate surprise for medieval monarchs, who often considered family members their most reliable source of future betrayal. The spear's reputation grew stronger precisely because powerful people kept chasing it. The more valuable it became, the more dramatic its legends became. Soon the relic was surrounded by tales of supernatural power. Some believed it could determine the fate of empires. Others thought it protected entire kingdoms. Meanwhile, the average medieval peasant was probably wondering whether the spear could help with taxes. Sadly, no such miracles were reported. What makes the Spear of Destiny fascinating is not whether it was cursed, blessed, or genuinely authentic. It is the fact that generations of rulers believed an object could guarantee victory. Again and again, they placed their faith in a relic rather than the far less exciting necessities of government. Competent leadership, stable finances, loyal allies, and armies that actually arrived when summoned. The spear promised certainty in an uncertain world. That was its real power, and perhaps its greatest curse. Because once people become convinced that a single object can solve all their problems, disappointment is usually only a matter of time. Not every cursed artifact was a jewel, a crown, or a sacred relic. Sometimes it was a book, which may not sound particularly threatening today. Most books spend their lives quietly sitting on shelves, occasionally being purchased with good intentions before joining a growing collection of unread companions. But in the Middle Ages, books were different. Books were rare. Books were expensive. Books contained knowledge that most people would never have access to. And some books were believed to contain knowledge that nobody should have access to. Stories circulated throughout medieval Europe about mysterious manuscripts filled with strange symbols, cryptic diagrams, forgotten languages, and instructions that supposedly revealed hidden secrets of the universe. Monks copied them. Scholars studied them. Church authorities occasionally worried about them. Everyone else made up increasingly alarming stories about them. One recurring legend involved books that could summon spirits or demons when certain passages were read aloud. Another claimed that some manuscripts revealed future events. Others supposedly contained magical formulas inherited from ancient civilizations. Naturally, these stories made the books even more popular. Human curiosity has always worked in predictable ways. Tell people a book contains dangerous forbidden knowledge, and they immediately want to read chapter 1. Some medieval scholars became obsessed with collecting rare texts. They travelled across Europe searching monastery libraries and noble collections for forgotten manuscripts. Occasionally they discovered genuinely valuable works. Occasionally they found books so confusing that later generations assumed supernatural forces must be involved. After all, if nobody understands what they're reading, magic becomes a surprisingly popular explanation. One famous category of feared manuscripts involved books of alchemy. These texts promised hidden wisdom, secret transformations, and occasionally the possibility of turning ordinary metals into gold. Thousands of intelligent people spent years chasing these mysteries. The results were mixed. Gold remained difficult to produce. Strange smells were considerably easier. As stories spread, certain manuscripts gained reputations for bringing misfortune to their owners. A scholar falls ill after studying a book. The book is cursed. A monastery burns down years after acquiring a manuscript. The book is cursed. A researcher spends 20 years trying to decode mysterious symbols and achieves absolutely nothing. The book is definitely cursed. Modern academics might call this normal research frustration. Medieval observers preferred darker explanations. Yet these legends reveal something fascinating about the medieval world. People feared knowledge almost as much as they desired it. Books represented power. Power could change lives, and anything powerful enough to transform a person's understanding of the world was also powerful enough to frighten them. That is why certain manuscripts became cursed artifacts, not because demons lived within their pages, but because knowledge itself can be unsettling, especially when the book seems to know more than you do, which, to be fair, describes most textbooks. If there was ever a medieval king who could make a cursed artifact seem believable, it was King John of England. Long before he became a favourite villain in Robin Hood stories, John had earned a reputation for bad decisions, political disasters, failed military campaigns, and arguments with nearly everyone he encountered. His reign was so chaotic that later generations often struggled to decide whether his problems were caused by bad luck, poor judgment, or divine punishment. Naturally, a cursed ring eventually entered the story. According to various legends that emerged after his death, a royal ring associated with King John carried misfortune wherever it went. Some claimed the ring had been blessed and then corrupted. Others insisted it had once belonged to a holy figure before falling into unworthy hands. The details changed from storyteller to storyteller. The disasters remained remarkably consistent. John inherited a powerful kingdom, but quickly found himself losing territory in France. Noble families grew restless. The church became furious with him. His treasury was constantly under pressure. At one point, he managed to anger the Pope himself. This was generally considered an ambitious mistake. Most people struggled to upset their neighbours. John expanded his efforts internationally. As his troubles multiplied, rumours spread that something dark followed him. The ring became an easy target. After all, blaming a cursed object is much simpler than explaining years of complicated political failures. The ring's sinister reputation only grew after John's death in 1216. Stories began connecting every setback to the artifact. A noble family inherited the ring and suffered financial losses. The ring was cursed. A landowner became involved in a bitter dispute. The ring was cursed. Someone misplaced important documents and spent 3 days searching for them. Given enough medieval chroniclers, the ring probably would have been blamed. What made the legend especially appealing was that it fit neatly into medieval ideas about morality. People wanted to believe that power obtained through greed or dishonour carried consequences. The ring became a symbol of that belief. Unlike magical swords or sacred relics, it represented something far more ordinary. temptation, a small object promising prestige and authority, the kind of treasure that could inspire jealousy, suspicion, and endless conflict. In reality, King John's troubles probably had less to do with curses and more to do with politics. Unfortunately for him, politics can sometimes look remarkably similar to a curse. Both tend to start with confidence and end with regret. By the late Middle Ages, the story of the ring had become part warning, part entertainment, and part moral lesson. And if the ring truly possessed supernatural power, it was remarkably selective. It never caused problems on its own. It merely seemed to find people already capable of creating plenty of problems without any assistance at all. Few medieval organizations attracted more legends than the Knights Templar. They began as a military order dedicated to protecting Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. They ended as one of the richest, most powerful, and most mysterious institutions in medieval Europe. And whenever a wealthy organization suddenly collapses, people start asking questions. Lots of questions. More importantly, they start inventing answers. By the early 14th century, the Templars possessed castles, treasure, land, ships, and influence stretching across Europe. Kings borrowed money from them. Nobles respected them. Ordinary people viewed them with a mixture of admiration and suspicion. The order had become so successful that it eventually encountered one of history's most dangerous cursed artifacts, a heavily indebted king. King Philip IV of France owed enormous sums to the Templars. Conveniently, he also happened to control an army. In 1307, he ordered the arrest of Templars throughout France. Members of the order were accused of heresy, blasphemy, and a variety of shocking crimes. Many historians believe the accusations were largely political. Medieval politics occasionally displayed all the subtlety of a siege engine crashing through a wall. As the Templars were imprisoned and their order dismantled, a new mystery emerged. Where had their treasures gone? Some wealth was confiscated, some property was seized, but rumours quickly spread that the most valuable relics had disappeared before the arrests began. That was when the curse stories started. According to legend, the Templars had possessed sacred relics, mysterious artifacts, ancient treasures, and secret objects so powerful they could alter the fate of kingdoms. Anyone who searched for them was said to suffer misfortune. Treasure hunters vanished. Nobles lost fortunes. Explorers met untimely deaths. Failed expeditions became evidence of supernatural protection. Successful expeditions mysteriously failed to find anything, which, admittedly, is one of the safest ways for a curse to maintain its reputation. The most famous story involved the final Grand Master of the Order, Jacques de Molay. Before his execution, legend claims he cursed King Philip and Pope Clement V, summoning divine judgment upon them. Remarkably, both men died within a year. To medieval observers, this seemed highly suspicious. To modern observers, it sounds like the 14th century simply continued being the 14th century. Nevertheless, the curse endured. For centuries, treasure hunters searched for lost Templar relics hidden beneath castles, buried in forests, concealed in churches, or transported to distant lands. Most found disappointment. A few found empty wallets, and some discovered the timeless truth that searching for legendary cursed treasure is rarely as profitable as the legends suggest. The greatest Templar curse may not have been supernatural at all. It was convincing generations of people that the treasure was still waiting just around the next corner. Among the countless relics displayed in medieval churches, monasteries and cathedrals, few inspired as much unease as the mysterious object known in later legends as the Black Reliquary of Prague. reliquaries were normally objects of comfort. They contained the bones of saints, fragments of holy garments, or other sacred items believed to connect the faithful to heaven. Pilgrims travelled enormous distances just to glimpse them. The Black Reliquary was different. People visited it out of devotion. They left with questions. According to various medieval stories, the reliquary appeared unusually dark, decorated with blackened metal and strange carvings that seemed older than the object itself. Some claimed it contained the remains of a forgotten saint. Others believed its contents had been misidentified centuries earlier. A few whispered that nobody truly knew what rested inside. And as every medieval storyteller understood, uncertainty is the fertile soil in which curses thrive. The relic was reportedly housed in Prague during a period when the city was becoming one of Central Europe's most important centres of religion, learning, and royal power. Pilgrims arrived from distant lands. Clergy debated theology, merchants exchanged goods, and rumours spread faster than all three combined. Visitors began reporting strange experiences. Some described vivid nightmares after seeing the reliquary. Others claimed they felt overwhelming dread while standing near it. A few insisted they heard whispers during prayer. Now, it is worth noting that medieval churches were often dimly lit buildings filled with flickering candles, shadowy corners, painted images of martyrdom, and sermons frequently describing the torments of hell. The average visitor was not exactly entering a relaxing spa environment. Nevertheless, stories multiplied. One tale described a nobleman who mocked the relic and later suffered a string of financial disasters. Another involved a thief who allegedly attempted to steal decorations from the reliquary before dying unexpectedly months later. To medieval audiences, these events seemed obvious. The curse had struck again. To modern audiences, the connection may appear slightly less convincing. After all, wealthy nobles frequently lost money, and medieval thieves generally enjoyed life expectancies that could be measured with impressive efficiency. Yet the reliquary's reputation only grew. Clergy treated it carefully. Pilgrims approached it cautiously. Chroniclers recorded its strange history. Every new misfortune added another layer to the legend. What made the Black Reliquary so frightening was not the object itself. It was the possibility that something sacred might also be dangerous. People expected cursed swords and cursed jewels. A cursed religious relic felt far more unsettling. Because if even holy objects could become sources of fear, then certainty became much harder to find. And in the medieval world, uncertainty was often the most frightening curse of all. At least until someone discovered another suspicious artifact and started the entire process again. If cursed artifacts had a favourite hobby, it would probably be attaching themselves to extremely wealthy people. The jewel of the Burgundian dukes was no exception. During the late Middle Ages, the Duchy of Burgundy became one of the richest and most powerful states in Europe. Its rulers possessed magnificent palaces, enormous wealth, and enough political influence to make kings nervous. This was an impressive achievement. Making kings nervous was generally considered one of the more dangerous hobbies available at the time. Among Burgundy's treasures was a magnificent gemstone surrounded by increasingly dark rumours. Chroniclers described it as dazzling, rare, and immensely valuable. The exact identity of the jewel became blurred over the centuries, but its reputation remained remarkably consistent. People believed it was cursed, and history seemed eager to help the legend. Some cursed artifacts frightened people because of their mysterious origins. Others frightened people because they looked exactly as unsettling as they sounded. The bone cross of the Crusades belonged firmly in the second category. According to medieval legends, This unusual relic was constructed using fragments of human bone, carefully incorporated into the shape of a Christian cross. Stories differed on whose remains had been used. Some claimed the bones belonged to martyrs. Others insisted they came from holy warriors who had died in the Holy Land. A few darker rumours suggested nobody actually knew, and that uncertainty made the relic even more disturbing. The cross reportedly appeared during the era of the Crusades, when Europe was flooded with relics returning from the East. Knights, pilgrims, and clergy brought home countless sacred objects, each carrying incredible stories. Some were genuine, some were questionable, and some would have required enough pieces of the true cross to construct an entire forest. Authenticity was occasionally treated as a flexible concept. The bone cross quickly gained a reputation unlike any ordinary relic. Soldiers carried it into battle seeking divine protection. Commanders displayed it before armies. Pilgrims prayed before it. Yet wherever the artifact appeared, stories of disaster seemed to follow. One crusading force suffered devastating losses shortly after carrying the cross into battle. The relic was blamed. A noble patron died unexpectedly after financing a chapel to house it. The relic was blamed. A monastery experienced famine and financial hardship after receiving the cross. Again, the relic was blamed. The artifact was becoming extraordinarily efficient. Soon, people whispered that the cross brought misfortune because it had been assembled improperly. Others believed it carried the restless spirits of those whose remains formed its structure. Some even claimed that strange sounds could be heard near it at night. Of course, medieval monasteries were often old stone buildings filled with creaking wood, wind tunnels, and exhausted monks sleeping in large communal rooms. Under such conditions, mysterious noises were practically included in the architecture. Nevertheless, the stories persisted. What made the bone cross particularly fascinating was the contradiction at its heart. It was a holy object, yet people feared it. It was meant to inspire faith, yet it inspired anxiety. The relic seemed to blur the line between blessing and curse. And perhaps that is why the legend endured. Because medieval people understood something modern people often forget. Objects can carry powerful meanings, not because of magic, but because of what people believe about them. The bone cross became dangerous because generations of people convinced themselves it was dangerous. And once enough people believe a relic is cursed, every tragedy starts looking like evidence. Especially during the Crusades, where tragedy was unfortunately never in short supply. Church bells were supposed to be reassuring. They marked the hours of the day. They called the faithful to prayer. They announced weddings, festivals, and holy days. Their sound carried across villages and fields, reminding people that order still existed in a world that often seemed determined to prove otherwise. The Devil's Bell had a somewhat different reputation. According to medieval legend, this particular bell hung in a church somewhere in Central Europe and quickly became associated with a string of disasters that nobody could adequately explain. At first, the incident seemed harmless enough. A bell ringer fell from the tower. Then another suffered a strange accident. A storm damaged part of the church shortly after the bell was installed. The villagers became nervous. The bell became famous, as is often the case with cursed objects. These two developments occurred simultaneously. Soon stories began circulating about the bell's unusual origins. Some claimed it had been cast using metal stolen from a pagan shrine. Others insisted that a mysterious stranger had contributed materials during its creation before disappearing forever. In medieval storytelling, mysterious strangers almost never brought good news. If someone arrived wearing black robes and speaking cryptically, the safest option was usually to move to another village. The bell's reputation grew with every passing year. Whenever it rang before a storm, people remembered. Whenever it rang and nothing happened, people forgot. This is one of the great advantages enjoyed by cursed artifacts. They are rarely required to explain their mistakes. One of the most popular legends claimed that the bell occasionally rang on its own. No one touched the ropes, no wind moved the clapper, yet the bell sounded across the countryside. To frightened villagers, this was proof that dark forces were at work. To modern observers, it sounds suspiciously like the sort of thing that happens when giant metal objects hang hundreds of feet in the air for decades. But medieval people preferred more exciting explanations. Another tale described a priest who openly mocked the bell's reputation. Shortly afterward, he became seriously ill. The connection seemed obvious. The curse had struck. The possibility that medieval illnesses occasionally occurred without supernatural involvement received remarkably little attention. Over time, the Devil's Bell became less famous for what it actually did, and more famous for what people imagined it could do. That is often how curses work. Fear grows larger than the object itself. A simple church bell became a symbol of danger, mystery, and divine warning. And yet, perhaps the most frightening thing about the Devil's Bell was not the possibility that demons rang it. It was the possibility that ordinary people, hearing a bell in the night, could convince themselves that they were hearing something far worse. Because once fear takes hold, the human imagination can be louder than any bell ever cast. Among all the cursed artifacts of the medieval world, few were as unsettling as a mirror. After all, a sword can wound you, a jewel can be stolen, a crown can start a war. But a mirror knows things. At least, that was the fear. The legendary mirror of Melisande was supposedly associated with Queen Melisande of Jerusalem, one of the most powerful women of the Crusader states. Whether the artifact truly belonged to her remains uncertain, but that did little to stop centuries of rumours from attaching themselves to the object. According to legend, the mirror was beautifully crafted, framed in silver, and decorated with intricate designs from both Europe and the East. It was said to be mesmerizing. It was also said to be cursed. The first stories claimed that the mirror revealed betrayal. Not immediately, of course. That would have been useful. Instead, people supposedly glimpsed strange reflections, fleeting shadows, or faces appearing where they should not have been. Some owners claimed they saw enemies standing behind them. Others reported seeing loved ones who had already died. Several claimed they saw their own future. This rarely improved their mood. As the stories spread, nobles became fascinated by the artifact. And like many cursed objects, the mirror's appeal seemed directly proportional to the danger surrounding it. The more terrifying the stories became, the more people wanted to look into it. Human beings have maintained this habit for centuries. Put a sign saying, "Do not enter," on a door, and someone immediately begins wondering what is inside. One medieval lord allegedly spent hours staring into the mirror each night, searching for hidden messages. Before long, he became convinced that several members of his household were plotting against him. Perhaps they were. Perhaps they were not. Either way, his paranoia created enough enemies to make the distinction largely irrelevant. Another tale described a noblewoman who supposedly saw signs of her husband's infidelity reflected in the glass. The resulting scandal became famous. The mirror received credit. The husband received considerably less sympathy. Over time, the artifact gained a reputation for revealing uncomfortable truths. This made it one of the most feared cursed objects in aristocratic circles. Not because it killed people, not because it summoned demons, but because it forced people to confront things they preferred not to know, or imagined things they wished they had never seen. The distinction became difficult to maintain. Perhaps that was the true curse of the Mirror of Melisande. Not supernatural visions, not dark magic, simply uncertainty. Because once a person begins doubting what they see, every reflection becomes suspicious. And in medieval courts, where conspiracies, betrayals and rivalries were already common, that was more than enough to create disaster. Sometimes the most dangerous cursed artifact is not the one that changes reality. It is the one that changes how people see it. Few medieval artifacts managed to combine religion, luxury, death, and deeply questionable dinner party decisions, quite like the skull chalice. According to legend, this ornate drinking vessel was crafted from a human skull, carefully decorated with silver, gold, and precious stones. Depending on who told the story, the skull belonged to a saint, a martyr, a defeated enemy, or a particularly unfortunate nobleman who discovered that dying was only the beginning of his involvement in the tale. Naturally, people argued endlessly about its origins. They agreed on one thing: the chalice was cursed. The artifact supposedly appeared in various noble collections throughout medieval Europe. Wealthy lords displayed it proudly during feasts, regarding it as a symbol of power and prestige, because apparently a normal gold cup was simply not dramatic enough. Guests would gather around candle-lit tables while servants carried enormous platters of food through crowded halls. Wine flowed freely, musicians played, and eventually someone would produce the skull chalice. At that point, the atmosphere generally became much more interesting. Some stories claimed that anyone who drank from the vessel would suffer terrible misfortune within a year. Others insisted the curse only affected dishonest people. This was a useful arrangement. Whenever something bad happened, the victim could be accused of secret wrongdoing. Whenever nothing happened, the curse was simply waiting. The chalice enjoyed excellent public relations. One noble family reportedly experienced a series of deaths after acquiring the artifact. The curse was blamed. A lord lost a legal dispute over valuable land. The curse was blamed. A lavish feast ended with several guests becoming violently ill. The curse was blamed. The possibility that medieval food preservation occasionally had room for improvement was rarely discussed. Refrigeration was not among the great achievements of the Middle Ages. As the stories spread, the skull chalice developed a reputation for exposing greed. Many legends followed a familiar pattern. A wealthy noble obtains the chalice. He becomes obsessed with owning it. Disaster follows. The moral lesson was difficult to miss. Medieval storytellers loved reminding audiences that excessive pride eventually leads to trouble, preferably expensive trouble. What makes the skull chalice fascinating is that it embodied several medieval fears at once: death, ambition, vanity, and the uneasy belief that sacred things should not be treated as decorations. Whether the artifact was genuinely cursed hardly mattered. People believed it represented a dangerous crossing of boundaries. The dead were meant to rest. Holy objects were meant to be respected. Wine cups were meant to be considerably less unsettling. By the end of the Middle Ages, the skull chalice had become one of the most infamous cursed artifacts in folklore. A perfect reminder that some collectibles are best left out of the dining room, especially the ones that may once have been using it. Hidden within a remote monastery, far from crowded cities and royal courts, there was said to be an object unlike any other. It was not made of gold. It was not covered in jewels. It possessed no elaborate decorations. In fact, according to the legends, it was simply a dark stone, and that simplicity somehow made it even more frightening. The black stone of the monastery first appeared in stories told by pilgrims travelling across medieval Europe. Descriptions varied, but most agreed that the stone was unusually smooth, almost unnaturally black, and seemed older than anyone could explain. The monks guarding it offered few answers, which naturally encouraged people to invent their own. Some claimed the stone had fallen from the sky. Others believed it had been discovered in the ruins of an ancient pagan temple. A few insisted it had been carried by saints during the earliest days of Christianity, and the more mysterious its origin became, the more powerful the legends surrounding it grew. Pilgrims travelled hundreds of miles to see the artifact. Many arrived hoping for blessings. Some hoped for healing. Others simply wanted to witness something extraordinary. After all, medieval entertainment options were somewhat limited. A mysterious stone with supernatural powers was considerably more exciting than watching your neighbour argue about sheep for the third consecutive day. The trouble began when stories of misfortune started appearing. One legend told of a thief who attempted to steal the stone during the night. According to the tale, he escaped the monastery successfully. Unfortunately, he became lost in the wilderness, suffered a series of accidents, and eventually returned the artifact in terror. The curse was blamed. Another story described a nobleman who tried to force the monks to surrender the stone. Within months, he allegedly lost money, influence, and political allies. The curse was blamed again. At this point, the stone was developing an impressive reputation for protecting monastery property, almost suspiciously impressive. Monks may not have possessed large armies, but a well-publicised curse could be remarkably effective security. Who needs guards when potential thieves believe supernatural punishment is included free of charge? As the centuries passed, the black stone became a symbol of divine mystery. People feared it. People respected it. Most importantly, people left it alone. Which was probably exactly what the monks wanted. Whether the stone truly possessed supernatural powers remains unknown, but its story reveals something important about the medieval world. People did not always fear what they understood. They feared what they could not explain. A dark stone with no clear origin could become anything in the imagination of those who encountered it. A blessing, a warning, a miracle, or a curse. And sometimes, uncertainty is the most powerful magic of all. Of all the cursed artifacts whispered about during the Middle Ages, none inspired more greed, fear, and bad decisions than the treasure of the dead king. Unlike the relics and objects we've discussed so far, this was not a single artifact. It was an entire collection. According to legend, somewhere beneath an ancient royal tomb lay a vast treasure buried alongside a long-forgotten king. Gold crowns, jewelled swords, silver vessels, precious gems, and sacred relics were all said to rest beside him. The problem was that the treasure supposedly came with a curse, a very enthusiastic curse. The earliest stories claimed that the king had been buried with immense wealth to accompany him into the afterlife. Priests blessed the tomb. Guards protected it. Oaths were sworn to ensure the burial would never be disturbed. Naturally, this only made people want to disturb it more. Human beings have always had a complicated relationship with warnings. Tell someone a treasure is protected by a terrible curse, and roughly half the population immediately begins planning an expedition. Over the centuries, countless treasure hunters allegedly searched for the burial site. Most failed to find it. Some disappeared. Others suffered accidents. Several lost fortunes financing their searches. The curse received credit for all of it. One famous tale described a nobleman who became obsessed with locating the king's tomb. He spent years funding excavations, hiring guides, and purchasing ancient maps. Eventually, he exhausted his fortune. The treasure remained missing. The curse remained undefeated. Another story involved a group of adventurers who supposedly discovered the entrance to the burial chamber. As they prepared to enter, strange events began occurring. Equipment broke. Animals refused to approach. Members of the expedition became frightened and abandoned the search. To medieval audiences, this was clear evidence of supernatural protection. To modern audiences, it sounds suspiciously like a group of people realizing they were about to crawl into a dark underground tomb with questionable structural integrity. Fear can occasionally be a survival mechanism, yet the legend continued to grow. Generation after generation became convinced that the treasure existed, and generation after generation failed to find it. That may have been the treasure's greatest curse. Not death, not demons, not divine wrath. Hope. The belief that unimaginable wealth was just one discovery away. The belief that one lucky find could solve every problem. History is full of people ruined by that idea. Perhaps that is why the story endured for centuries, because the most dangerous cursed artifact is not always the one hidden in a tomb. Sometimes it is the dream that convinces you to spend your life searching for it, and somewhere, if the legends are true, the dead king is still resting peacefully beside his treasure, probably laughing. For most medieval knights, life followed a fairly predictable path. You inherited land, served your lord, married, produced heirs, argued with neighbouring nobles over fields that barely seemed worth the trouble, and hoped to avoid dying from something embarrassing. It was not always exciting, but it was familiar. The man who chose to become a Templar knight deliberately walked away from that future. The story usually began with the crusading movement that swept across Europe after the capture of Jerusalem in the late 11th century. News travelled slowly in the medieval world, but stories of the Holy Land spread remarkably far. Pilgrims returned with tales of sacred places, dangerous roads, and warrior monks who protected travellers from bandits and raiders. These warrior monks belonged to a relatively new organisation known as the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. Their name was long enough to discourage casual conversation, so most people simply called them the Templars. To many young noblemen, the order seemed almost legendary. The Templars fought in battle like professional soldiers. They lived under religious vows like monks. They served a cause believed to be greater than any individual kingdom. In an age obsessed with faith, honour, and warfare, it was difficult to imagine a more prestigious calling. Yet the reality was far less glamorous than many recruits expected. The Templars owned no personal property. They followed strict rules governing nearly every aspect of daily life. Their clothing, meals, sleeping arrangements, and behaviour were carefully regulated. Individual ambition was discouraged. Personal comfort ranked somewhere between unimportant and completely irrelevant. Before a man could even request admission, he had to confront a difficult truth. Joining the order meant surrendering much of what medieval society valued. Marriage would be forbidden. Personal wealth would disappear into the order. Future children would never exist. Family estates would pass to someone else. A man who entered the Templars effectively died to his former life while remaining physically alive. For some families, this decision created tension. Noble parents often invested years preparing sons to inherit lands and continue family lines. Watching a capable heir volunteer to become a celibate warrior monk could be a frustrating experience. Medieval fathers rarely expressed this frustration through modern family counselling. They generally preferred louder methods. Yet despite these sacrifices, thousands sought admission over the centuries. Some were driven by genuine religious devotion. Others sought redemption for past sins. Some hungered for adventure. Many were motivated by a mixture of all three. Whatever his reason, the aspiring recruit soon discovered that wanting to become a Templar was not enough. The order would decide whether he was worthy, and that examination was about to begin. Deciding to become a Templar Knight was the easy part. The difficult part was convincing the Templars themselves. Unlike many noble positions in medieval Europe, admission into the order could not simply be purchased. Wealth helped in life, as it usually does, but the brothers were far more interested in whether a man could survive within their strict system. A rich recruit who could not obey orders was less useful than a poorer one who could. The process often began when a candidate approached a Templar house and announced his desire to join. This was not treated as exciting news. No bells rang, no celebrations followed. Nobody handed him a white cloak and congratulated him on becoming part of history. Instead, the brothers immediately began looking for reasons to reject him. The order needed trustworthy men. Their castles, treasure houses, military plans, and distant outposts depended on mutual confidence. A dishonest recruit could create problems stretching from England to Jerusalem. The questioning, therefore, became surprisingly thorough. Was the candidate married? Did he owe money? Had he made promises to another religious order? Was he joining freely, or was someone forcing him? Did he suffer from any serious illnesses he was trying to hide? The Templars wanted answers to everything. Marriage represented one of the biggest obstacles. A married man generally could not become a full Templar Knight because the order required complete dedication. The brothers did not want members worrying about wives, children, inheritances, or family disputes while stationed hundreds of miles away in a frontier fortress. Debt created another problem. Imagine a creditor arriving at a Templar castle demanding repayment from a newly admitted knight. The brothers preferred to avoid such awkward situations entirely. Even social status mattered. Most knight brothers came from noble families because becoming a mounted warrior required expensive training, armour, weapons, and horses. Years of preparation were necessary. You could not simply wake up one morning, borrow a sword, and announce that you were now a professional crusader, at least not successfully. The order also watched for motivation. Some applicants arrived seeking spiritual salvation. Others genuinely wanted to protect pilgrims. A few probably imagined dramatic battlefield heroics, cheering crowds, and eternal fame. The Templars tended to be suspicious of that last group. They understood something many young recruits did not. Life inside the order was usually far more discipline than glory, more prayer than heroics, more obedience than adventure. And before a candidate could learn that lesson firsthand, he would face the most important meeting of his life, the secret admission ceremony. If a candidate survived the initial scrutiny, he was invited to participate in one of the most important and mysterious moments of his life, the Templar admission ceremony. Unlike many medieval religious ceremonies, this event took place behind closed doors. Only members of the order were allowed to attend. This secrecy later caused enormous trouble for the Templars. Over the centuries, rumours multiplied. Enemies accused them of conducting strange rituals, worshipping hidden idols, and participating in bizarre ceremonies. Most of these accusations appeared long after the events themselves, usually from people who had never witnessed a Templar reception. The actual ceremony was much less dramatic than the rumours suggested. What made it powerful was not mystery, but commitment. The candidate entered a gathering of Templar brothers and formally requested admission. This was often not the first time he had asked. The order wanted absolute certainty that he understood the consequences of his choice. The questioning began again. The same subjects returned repeatedly. Were you married? Did you owe money? Were you bound by promises elsewhere? Were you physically capable of serving? Had you hidden any information from the order? To a modern observer, the process might seem repetitive. To the Templars, repetition was intentional. A man could lie once. It was harder to lie consistently under constant examination. Once the brothers were satisfied, the candidate received a final warning. This warning was remarkably blunt. He was told that life inside the order would be difficult. The food would not always be good. The clothing would be simple. The rules would be strict. Personal desires would matter very little. The message was essentially, if you enjoy comfort, now is an excellent time to leave. No one would stop him. The order preferred losing a recruit today rather than dealing with a regretful brother later. If the candidate still wished to proceed, he knelt before the assembly and swore the vows required by the order. These promises were not temporary commitments. They were intended to last for life. The brothers then accepted him into their community. At that moment, something profound occurred. His former identity began to fade. He was no longer simply the son of a noble family, an ambitious young knight, or the heir to an estate. He now belonged to the temple. His loyalty shifted from family interests to the order's mission. His future became tied to thousands of brothers spread across Europe and the Holy Land. And with a few solemn vows, the freedoms of his old life disappeared. The first and perhaps most difficult sacrifice was about to begin, the vow of poverty, the vow of, the moment a man became a Templar, he entered a world where personal wealth ceased to matter, at least in theory. This was the first great paradox of the order. The Templars eventually became one of the wealthiest organizations in medieval Europe. They owned castles, farms, mills, vineyards, ports, ships, and vast stretches of land. Kings borrowed money from them. Nobles donated fortunes. Pilgrims entrusted them with valuables. Yet the individual Templar owned absolutely nothing. Not his horse, not his sword, not even the shirt on his back. Everything belonged to the order. For a young nobleman raised in a society obsessed with inheritance and status, this represented a radical transformation. Imagine spending your childhood being told that one day you would inherit lands, servants, and wealth, only to voluntarily sign it all away. Many medieval fathers probably found this difficult to understand. Some likely reacted with the medieval equivalent of, "I spent 20 years preparing you for this estate, and now you want to sleep in a monastery with a sword." The vow of poverty required a recruit to surrender personal possessions to the order. Any property he retained became controlled by the Brotherhood. Gifts received later belonged to the temple as well. The reasoning was simple. Personal wealth created personal interests. Personal interests created divisions. Divisions weakened unity. The Templars wanted every brother focused on the same mission. A knight worrying about expanding his private fortune was not fully committed to protecting pilgrims or defending frontier castles. The rule extended into daily life. Clothing was standardized. Equipment was distributed according to need. Meals were shared. Luxury was discouraged. Even small signs of vanity attracted criticism. A brother was not supposed to compete with fellow Templars over who owned the finest horse or the most impressive sword, because technically none of them owned anything. Of course, human nature remained human nature. Medieval knights did not suddenly become saints simply because they wore white cloaks. The rule of the Templars contains numerous regulations aimed at preventing pride, greed, and excessive attachment to material things. The existence of these rules suggests the problem appeared often enough to require attention. Still, most brothers accepted the sacrifice. They believed they were exchanging earthly wealth for something greater: spiritual purpose, religious devotion, a place in a brotherhood that stretched across continents. Yet surrendering possessions was only the beginning. Many men could part with money. The next vow demanded something far more difficult. It required surrendering the right to choose their own future. The vow of obedience. If the vow of poverty stripped away a man's possessions, the vow of obedience stripped away something even more valuable: his independence. For most medieval knights, personal freedom was one of the greatest rewards of noble birth. A knight might owe service to a lord, but he still controlled many aspects of his own life. He decided where to travel, how to spend his money, whom to associate with, and how to manage his estates. A Templar surrendered those choices. From the day he entered the order, obedience became one of his highest duties. The rule of the Templars left little room for interpretation. Brothers were expected to obey their superiors promptly and without complaint. Orders flowed downward through a carefully organized chain of command, and questioning those orders was strongly discouraged. This was not because the Templars enjoyed controlling people, at least not officially. The reality was that the order operated military fortresses, protected dangerous roads, and fought wars against experienced enemies. In battle, hesitation could get dozens of men killed. The Templars believed discipline saved lives. A knight who instantly obeyed commands was more valuable than a brilliant warrior who constantly argued. The expectation of obedience extended far beyond warfare. A brother might be ordered to leave France and travel to Jerusalem. He went. A knight stationed comfortably in a wealthy commandery could suddenly be assigned to a remote desert fortress. He went. A brother hoping to remain near family might receive orders sending him hundreds of miles away. Again, he went. Personal preferences carried little weight. The order's needs came first. This could be difficult for recruits from noble families. Many had grown up surrounded by servants, privileges, and social status. They were accustomed to giving commands rather than receiving them. Inside the temple, those habits could become liabilities. A wealthy nobleman might find himself obeying a commander from a less prestigious family. Rank within the order mattered far more than birth. That was one of the reasons the Templars became so effective. On the battlefield, enemies did not care who your grandfather was. The rule even regulated surprisingly small details of daily life. Brothers required permission for various activities. Meals followed schedules. Travel followed orders. Daily routines followed established procedures. To modernize, it could appear restrictive. To the Templars, it created unity. Thousands of men spread across Europe, and the Holy Land could function as a single organization because they accepted the same discipline. Yet even obedience had limits. There remained one final vow that many recruits found the most challenging of all. Because unlike wealth or freedom, this sacrifice touched one of humanity's oldest desires, the vow of chastity. Of all the sacrifices required to become a Templar knight, none was more personal than the vow of chastity. Poverty affected possessions. Obedience affected freedom. Chastity affected an entire future. The moment a man entered the order, he gave up any possibility of marriage, children, or romantic relationships. For the rest of his life, he was expected to devote himself entirely to God and the mission of the temple. This was no small demand in medieval society. Family stood at the centre of noble life. Alliances were built through marriage. Estates passed through bloodlines. Dynasties rose and fell based on who married whom. For a nobleman, producing heirs was often considered one of his primary responsibilities. The Templars asked him to abandon that responsibility completely. No wife, no children, no descendants carrying his name into the future. When a knight joined the order, his family line effectively ended with him. The reasoning behind the vow was both religious and practical. The Church taught that celibacy allowed a man to focus more fully on spiritual matters. The Templars adopted this belief, arguing that a brother should dedicate all his attention to God rather than dividing his loyalties between faith and family. There was also a military advantage. A knight defending a castle under siege could not worry about a wife waiting at home. A commander sent to a dangerous frontier could not refuse because of family obligations. The order wanted complete commitment. Anything less was considered a distraction. The rule of the Templars reflected this concern with remarkable seriousness. Brothers were forbidden from being alone with women whenever possible. Contact with female relatives was limited. Even seemingly harmless interactions could attract scrutiny. Modern readers often find some of these regulations excessive. The Templars clearly believed temptation was best defeated by avoiding situations that might create it. Their solution was straightforward. If a problem could potentially occur, create a rule against it. Then create another rule to enforce the first rule. Then perhaps a third rule, just to be safe. This approach appears frequently throughout medieval history. Of course, the vow was not always easy to uphold. The Templars were human beings, not statues carved from stone. They experienced the same desires and emotions as everyone else. Church records and disciplinary actions occasionally reveal brothers who violated their vows. When such cases occurred, punishments could be severe. The order viewed chastity as essential to its identity. A Templar who broke this promise threatened not only his own reputation, but the reputation of the entire brotherhood. Yet, after accepting poverty, obedience, and chastity, a recruit still faced an even greater challenge. Now he had to live those vows every single day. Taking the vows was a single ceremony. Living by them was a lifelong challenge. Many young recruits likely imagined their greatest test would come on a battlefield somewhere in the Holy Land, charging against enemy cavalry beneath the blazing sun. More often, their greatest challenge came during ordinary days. The Templars lived according to a detailed set of regulations known simply as the Rule. Originally influenced by monastic traditions and later expanded over time, it governed nearly every aspect of daily life. And when historians say nearly every aspect, they mean it. The Rule covered prayer schedules, it covered meals, it covered clothing, it covered sleeping arrangements, it covered how horses were managed, it even covered how brothers should behave while eating at the table. The order left remarkably little to chance. A typical day began before sunrise. Brothers attended prayers, performed duties, trained, worked, and participated in additional religious services throughout the day. Whether stationed in France, England, or Jerusalem, their lives followed a carefully structured rhythm. Personal freedom remained limited. A knight could not simply decide to take a ride through the countryside because the weather seemed pleasant. He could not wander into town looking for entertainment. He could not suddenly announce that he needed a vacation from religious discipline. The temple did not recognize such concepts. Life was organized around duty. Meals reflected this philosophy as well. Templar food was generally simple and practical. Excessive luxury was discouraged. Brothers often ate together in silence, while passages from religious texts were read aloud. Imagine trying to enjoy dinner while someone continuously reminds you about spiritual discipline. The medieval dining experience was apparently determined to remain educational. Even clothing was regulated. The famous white mantle worn by knight brothers symbolized purity and commitment. It was not meant to be fashionable. In fact, the order actively discouraged vanity. Flashy decorations, excessive grooming, and displays of wealth were viewed with suspicion. A Templar's appearance was supposed to reflect humility rather than status. The same applied to horses and equipment. While knights required quality gear for military effectiveness, the rule discouraged unnecessary extravagance. Brothers were expected to care for their equipment, not show it off. All of these regulations served a single purpose. The Templars wanted thousands of men from different kingdoms, languages, and backgrounds to function as one unified brotherhood. Discipline created consistency, consistency created reliability, reliability created military strength. But no amount of training or regulation could change one simple fact. The Templars were not preparing men merely for orderly daily routines. They were preparing them for war. And war was where the true cost of becoming a Templar often revealed itself. For all the prayers, vows, and discipline that shaped a Templar's life, the order ultimately existed for one reason: war. Not war for personal gain, not war for land or family ambition. At least in theory, the Templars fought to defend Christian territories and protect pilgrims travelling through dangerous regions of the Holy Land. The reality, however, was far less romantic than many recruits imagined. A new brother entering the order might dream of glorious victories, heroic charges, and songs celebrating his courage. The veterans knew better. They understood that war was mostly exhaustion interrupted by moments of terror. Templar knights spent countless hours training with weapons, maintaining equipment, caring for horses, patrolling roads, guarding castles, and preparing for battles that might never come. Then, when battle finally arrived, everything happened very quickly. The order developed a reputation for extraordinary discipline on the battlefield. Unlike many medieval armies, which could collapse into chaos once fighting began, the Templars were trained to operate as a coordinated force. Their most famous weapon was the cavalry charge. A formation of heavily armoured Templar knights charging at full speed could be devastating. Horses thundered across the battlefield, lances lowered, shields locked together. The impact often resembled a moving wall of steel. It was terrifying for enemies. It was not particularly relaxing for the men involved either. The order expected its brothers to hold their ground even in desperate situations. Retreat was heavily restricted. A Templar knight could not simply decide he had seen enough excitement for one day and ride home. The rule demanded courage and obedience under the worst conditions imaginable. This expectation came with a terrible cost. Templars suffered enormous casualties throughout their history. Many frontier castles stood in isolated regions where reinforcements might take weeks to arrive. Brothers often found themselves defending positions while heavily outnumbered. Some died in famous battles. Others perished during sieges. Many disappeared into the endless violence that defined the Crusader states. The Order considered this sacrifice part of its mission. Every recruit understood that joining the Templars significantly increased the likelihood of dying far from home. There would be no comfortable retirement, no quiet estate waiting at the end of service, no grandchildren listening to stories beside a fireplace. A Templar accepted the possibility that his life might end on a distant battlefield beneath the walls of an unfamiliar city. And strangely enough, that was exactly what made the Order so respected, because everyone knew the risks, and the brothers joined anyway. Yet surviving war did not mean a Templar's challenges were over. His greatest test was remaining faithful to his vows year after year, decade after decade, until the very end of his life. For a Templar knight, the true challenge was never joining the Order. It was staying worthy of it. The admission ceremony lasted only a short time. The vows were spoken in a single evening. The white mantle was placed upon his shoulders in a matter of moments. But becoming a genuine brother of the temple took years. perhaps even a lifetime. Once accepted into the order, a new recruit entered a world where every day tested the promises he had made. Poverty was no longer an idea discussed during a ceremony. It became reality. Every possession belonged to the order. Every meal was shared. Every comfort was limited. Obedience became equally constant. A brother might spend years serving faithfully in one commandery, only to receive orders sending him across Europe or into the Holy Land. Personal preferences did not matter. The needs of the temple always came first. The same applied to chastity. The vow was not difficult because it lasted a week or a month. It was difficult because it lasted forever. As years passed, brothers watched friends die, kingdoms rise and fall, and families continue without them. The children of younger siblings inherited estates. Nephews became lords. Entire generations appeared and disappeared. The Templar remained where duty required him. For many men, this sense of purpose became the reward itself. The order provided something rare in the medieval world, a life dedicated to a single mission. A Templar knew exactly who he was, what he served, and what was expected of him. Before an Ottoman couple could become engaged, before gifts were exchanged, before families gathered for formal visits, and certainly before wedding celebrations filled the streets with music and food, one important question had to be answered. Who was going to marry whom? For most people in the Ottoman Empire, marriage was not simply a matter of personal attraction. It was a family decision, a social arrangement, and sometimes an economic partnership all at once. Two individuals were marrying, but so were two households, two reputations, and occasionally two carefully calculated sets of expectations. The process usually began with the groom's family. More specifically, it began with the women of the family. A young man's mother, sisters, aunts, and older female relatives became unofficial matchmakers. They quietly searched for suitable candidates within their community. Unlike modern dating applications, which somehow allow people to reject one another based on favourite pizza toppings, Ottoman matchmaking focused on rather different criteria. Character mattered, family reputation mattered, religious devotion mattered, household skills mattered. The goal was to find a woman who would be respected as a wife, mother, and member of the extended family. Information travelled through neighbourhoods surprisingly quickly. Women exchanged news during visits, market trips, celebrations, and social gatherings. Through these conversations, families learned who had a daughter of marriageable age, which households enjoyed good reputations, and which families might be suitable matches. Not every household received equal consideration. Families often preferred spouses from similar social backgrounds. Merchants frequently looked among merchant families. Artisans often preferred connections with other respected artisans. Wealthy households generally paid attention to wealth. This tendency is hardly unique to Ottoman history. Humans have spent thousands of years claiming money is not important, while simultaneously asking detailed questions about it. Once a potential bride was identified, discreet inquiries began. The groom's relatives wanted to know everything. Was she known for kindness? Was she hard-working? Did she manage household responsibilities well? How did neighbours speak about her family? A poor reputation could end negotiations before they ever started. A good reputation, meanwhile, could make a family highly sought after. The young woman herself was often observed carefully during social occasions, family gatherings, or community events. Direct courtship remained limited in many Ottoman communities, meaning relatives played a major role in gathering information. Only after weeks or even months of quiet investigation would a family decide whether to take the next step. If they liked what they learned, a formal visit would be arranged. And that visit marked the true beginning of the engagement process. Once the groom's family believed they had found a suitable bride, the next stage began. The formal visit. This was one of the most important moments in the entire engagement process because it transformed private interest into a public possibility. Up until now, everything had happened quietly. Relatives gathered information, neighbours exchanged opinions, and families considered their options. Now people had to meet. Traditionally, the groom's mother played a central role. Along with female relatives, she would visit the home of the young woman and her family. These visits were conducted with great politeness because everyone understood the delicate nature of the situation. Nobody wanted to appear too eager. Nobody wanted to appear uninterested either. As a result, Ottoman marriage negotiations often unfolded through a careful dance of courtesy, indirect language, and social etiquette. The visiting women observed everything. And when historians say everything, they mean everything. The condition of the home, the behaviour of family members, the manners of the young woman, how she spoke, how she moved, how she treated guests. The future bride was not expected to deliver a speech or defend a thesis on household management. Instead, she was judged through everyday interactions. Could she carry herself with dignity? Did she appear respectful? Did she demonstrate good upbringing? These details mattered enormously. Meanwhile, refreshments were usually served. Coffee became especially important during later Ottoman centuries. A simple cup of coffee could accompany discussions that might determine the future of two families. No pressure, of course. Just your entire future being quietly evaluated while everyone pretended they were discussing ordinary matters. The young woman herself often remained modest and reserved during the visit. Open displays of affection or direct conversations between potential spouses were uncommon in many Ottoman communities. This was not a romance conducted through dramatic declarations. It was a process built upon family approval and social reputation. The bride's family also evaluated the visitors. Marriage negotiations worked both ways. The groom's household needed to prove its respectability as well. A wealthy family with a terrible reputation could be less attractive than a modest family known for honesty and good character. By the end of the visit, no final decision was usually announced. That would have been far too simple. Instead, families returned home to discuss what they had seen and heard. Opinions were exchanged. Relatives debated. Concerns were raised. If both sides remained interested, another meeting would follow. And during that next stage, the conversation would move beyond impressions and politeness. It would become a discussion about whether the marriage should actually happen. If the first visit went well, the process moved into far more serious territory. The families were no longer simply gathering impressions. Now they had to decide whether a marriage should actually take place. This stage was known as the formal request for the bride's hand. In Ottoman society, this was one of the most significant moments before an engagement. A family could spend weeks or even months considering a match, but eventually someone had to ask the question directly. The groom's family would arrange another visit to the bride's home. Unlike the earlier meeting, this gathering carried a very specific purpose. Everyone present understood why they were there. Nobody needed to pretend the visit was merely social. The groom's father, senior male relatives, and respected family members often participated alongside female relatives. Age and experience carried considerable weight in Ottoman culture, so older family members frequently led the discussion. After the usual greetings and hospitality, the formal request was made. Traditionally, the groom's family would ask the bride's parents for permission to marry their daughter. The language varied from region to region, but the request was generally expressed with great respect. The bride was not viewed as property being transferred from one household to another, despite common modern assumptions. Under Islamic law, a woman retained important legal rights regarding marriage, property, and inheritance. Nevertheless, family approval remained enormously influential. Marriage affected the entire household, and parental involvement was expected. Interestingly, the bride's family often did not immediately accept the proposal, even if they fully approved. In many communities, custom encouraged a degree of hesitation. An immediate acceptance could appear too eager. Families sometimes declined once or twice before agreeing later, allowing everyone to demonstrate dignity and proper restraint. To modern observers, this may seem unnecessarily complicated. To Ottoman families, it was part of good manners. Historical court records and personal accounts suggest that reputation and honour often mattered as much as the actual answer itself. The discussions extended beyond simple approval. Families considered practical questions. Would the groom be able to support a household? Did both families share similar values? Would the match strengthen existing social ties? Were there any concerns that had not yet been addressed? Marriage was expected to last a lifetime, so careful consideration was encouraged. If the answer was ultimately positive, both households entered a new phase. The possibility of marriage became an expectation. The negotiations grew more detailed. Families began discussing financial arrangements, responsibilities, and the agreements that would shape the future union. And among those discussions, one topic stood above all others: the marriage contract and the bride's dowry. Once both families agreed that the marriage should move forward, the atmosphere changed noticeably. The uncertainty was largely gone. Now came the practical discussions. And while these conversations lack the excitement of modern romance stories, they were often the most important part of the entire engagement process. Marriage in the Ottoman Empire was not simply a social ceremony. It was also a legal agreement governed by Islamic law. This meant that certain responsibilities, rights, and financial obligations needed to be clearly established before the wedding could take place. At the centre of these discussions stood the mehr, sometimes called the bridal gift. This was one of the most misunderstood aspects of Ottoman marriage. The mehr was not a payment made to the bride's father, nor was it a purchase price for marriage. Instead, it was a legal gift that belonged exclusively to the bride herself. The amount varied enormously. A wealthy merchant's daughter in Istanbul might receive a substantial mehr, consisting of money, jewellery, property, or valuable goods. In a rural village, the amount might be more modest, but remained equally important. Whatever its size, it belonged to the bride. Not her father, not her husband, not her brothers. Her. This provided an important layer of financial security, particularly if the marriage later ended through divorce or widowhood. Families spent considerable time discussing these arrangements. The groom's household wanted terms they could realistically fulfill. The bride's family wanted assurances that their daughter would be protected. Neither side wanted misunderstandings after the marriage. As a result, negotiations could become surprisingly detailed. Money was discussed. Property was discussed. Future responsibilities were discussed. Fortunately, most of this happened between parents and senior relatives, rather than the young couple themselves. Imagine being 16 years old and listening to half a dozen relatives debate legal obligations for 3 straight hours. Even medieval teenagers probably preferred literally anything else. Beyond finances, the families also discussed expectations. Would the couple live with the groom's parents? Would they establish a separate household? What responsibilities would each family continue to hold after the wedding? These questions mattered because marriage connected 2 extended families, not merely 2 individuals. Once agreements were reached, confidence in the match grew considerably. The proposal had moved beyond possibility. It was becoming a formal commitment. Only one major step remained before the couple could officially be considered engaged. The families needed to announce their agreement publicly, and that announcement often came during one of the most anticipated gatherings in the entire process, the engagement ceremony itself. After weeks of discussions, family visits, and negotiations, the moment finally arrived. The engagement could be announced. For the young couple, this marked the transition from possibility to expectation. The marriage had not yet taken place, but everyone now understood that the families had reached an agreement. Barring unexpected complications, the wedding would follow. In many parts of the Ottoman Empire, the engagement ceremony was a joyful social event that brought together relatives, neighbours, and close friends. The exact customs varied across the empire's enormous territory. What happened in Istanbul might differ from practices in Anatolia, the Balkans, Syria, or Egypt. Yet the basic purpose remained the same. The two families publicly declared their intention to unite. This public aspect was extremely important. A private understanding between families carried weight. A public announcement carried far more. Once relatives, neighbours, and community members knew about the engagement, the commitment became part of the couple's social identity. News travelled quickly through Ottoman neighbourhoods. Very quickly. In fact, one of the few things that moved faster than military messengers in the Ottoman world was community gossip. An engagement announcement could spread through an entire district before the refreshments had been cleared from the tables. The gathering itself was usually festive. Guests arrived in their finest clothing, food was prepared, sweets were distributed, conversations filled the house. Families who had previously been strangers now spent hours together as future relatives. For the bride, this day often carried special significance. She might receive gifts from the groom's family, including jewellery, fabrics, scarves, coins, or other valuable items. These gifts symbolised both affection and commitment. The exchange demonstrated that the groom's family was serious about the match. It also allowed them to display generosity and respect toward their future daughter-in-law. In wealthier households, the gifts could be remarkably elaborate. In humbler families, they might be simpler. The value mattered less than the gesture itself. Meanwhile, the groom's family received hospitality from the bride's household, reinforcing the growing relationship between the two sides. The engagement did not create a marriage yet. This distinction remained important. The couple still had to wait for the wedding contract and ceremony. However, from a social perspective, everything had changed. The young man and woman were now known as future husband and wife. Families began planning the next stage. Preparations intensified. Lists were made. Expenses were calculated. Relatives volunteered opinions whether anyone requested them or not. Because now the engagement was official, and the long process of preparing for marriage had truly begun. Once the engagement became official, the relationship between the two families entered a new phase. The difficult negotiations were mostly finished. Now came the preparations. And preparations in the Ottoman Empire had a remarkable tendency to expand. What began as a straightforward effort to organise a wedding could gradually involve dozens of relatives, endless discussions, and enough planning to rival a small military campaign. The engagement period could last weeks, months, or sometimes even longer depending on the circumstances of the families involved. This waiting period served several purposes. It gave both households time to prepare financially. It allowed wedding arrangements to be organised. And perhaps most importantly, it provided an opportunity for the two families to become better acquainted. During this period, gift exchanges became increasingly common. The groom's family often sent valuable presents to the bride. These might include jewellery, embroidered fabrics, silk garments, scarves, perfumes, or gold coins. Wealthier families sometimes provided exceptionally lavish gifts intended to demonstrate both generosity and status. Not surprisingly, neighbouring families occasionally paid close attention to these exchanges. Human curiosity regarding other people's finances did not suddenly appear in modern times. It has a very long history. The bride's family also prepared gifts and household items for the future marriage. Clothing, bedding, blankets, embroidered linens, carpets, cushions, and other domestic necessities were gradually assembled. Many of these items formed part of what was commonly known as the bride's trousseau. This collection represented years of preparation in some households. Young women often spent considerable time creating embroidered textiles and decorative items long before engagement was even discussed. Skills in sewing, embroidery, and household management were highly valued throughout much of Ottoman society. As the wedding approached, these carefully prepared possessions would eventually accompany the bride into her new home. The engagement period also brought increased social interaction between the families. Visits became more frequent, meals were shared, relationships strengthened. Future in-laws who had once been complete strangers gradually became part of each other's lives. Of course, this process was not always perfectly smooth. Occasional disagreements emerged regarding expenses, wedding plans, guest lists, or expectations. Anyone who has ever helped organise a large family event will find this development entirely unsurprising. Fortunately, most families worked hard to maintain harmony. The engagement represented a public commitment, and neither side wished to damage its reputation through unnecessary conflict. As preparations continued, another important question slowly moved to the forefront. Where would the newly married couple actually live? Because before the wedding could take place, a future household needed to be ready for its newest members. As the engagement period continued, attention gradually shifted toward one practical question that every Ottoman family eventually had to answer. Where would the newly married couple live? A wedding could be planned, gifts could be exchanged, relatives could celebrate, but unless the future household was ready, the marriage itself could not properly begin. For the groom, preparing a home was one of the most important responsibilities before the wedding. Ottoman society generally expected a husband to provide the basic foundation for family life. This did not necessarily mean building a new house from scratch. In many cases, the groom would live in a family home, occupy a separate section of a larger household, or rent a residence appropriate to his means. The exact arrangement depended heavily on social class and local custom. Wealthy merchants might establish an entirely new household. Artisans often lived near their workshops. Farmers usually remained close to family lands. In many cases, several generations shared the same property. Modern people sometimes imagine that every newly married couple immediately moved into their own private residence. Ottoman reality was often more crowded. Privacy existed, but it was frequently surrounded by parents, siblings, grandparents, cousins, and enough relatives to fill an entire courtyard. The bride's arrival required careful preparation. Furniture had to be arranged, carpets laid out, storage chests filled, kitchen equipment gathered, bedding prepared. The future home needed to demonstrate that the groom was capable of supporting a family. For this reason, the engagement period could become financially demanding. A respectable household was not assembled overnight. Many families saved for years in anticipation of future marriages. Meanwhile, the bride's trousseau continued to grow. The embroidered linens, blankets, cushions, clothing, and household textiles prepared by her family were gradually organised for their eventual transfer. In some communities, neighbours and relatives were invited to admire these items before the wedding. This served a practical purpose. It also provided an excellent opportunity for everyone to discuss them at length. Human beings have always enjoyed evaluating other people's decorating choices. As preparations advanced, excitement began building throughout both families. The engagement had already been announced. The household was nearly ready. Relatives started discussing wedding dates. Guests anticipated invitations. Children looked forward to celebrations and sweets. The entire community understood what was coming next. The marriage itself was approaching, but before the festivities could begin, one final legal step remained. The union had to be formally recognized through the marriage contract, and that contract would transform an engagement into a binding commitment under Ottoman law. By the time the engagement period reached its final stages, most of the major decisions had already been made. The families had met. The proposal had been accepted. The gifts had been exchanged. The household was nearly ready. Now only one crucial step remained before the wedding could take place. The marriage contract. In the Ottoman Empire, marriage was not simply a religious or social event. It was also a legal agreement recognized by Islamic law and often recorded by local courts. This legal foundation provided structure and protection for both husband and wife. Without the contract, there was no marriage. The ceremony surrounding the contract varied depending on region, social class, and local traditions, but certain elements remained remarkably consistent throughout the empire. One of the most important requirements was consent. Contrary to many modern assumptions, Islamic law required the agreement of the bride and groom for a valid marriage. While family influence could be powerful and social pressure certainly existed, legal scholars generally emphasized that marriage could not simply be imposed without consent. This principle became especially important during the contract process. Witnesses were present, terms were clarified, agreements were confirmed. The mare that had been negotiated earlier was formally included. Everything needed to be clear. Ottoman judges, known as qadis, often recorded marriage agreements in official registers. These records still survive in many archives today, providing historians with remarkable insights into ordinary people's lives. Through these documents, we can see marriages involving merchants, craftsmen, farmers, soldiers, widows, and members of nearly every social class. In a sense, these centuries-old records preserve the paperwork of countless love stories, family arrangements, and future households. Perhaps less romantic than poetry, but considerably easier for historians to verify. For the bride, the contract provided important legal protections. The agreed mare became an enforceable obligation. Property rights remained recognized. Financial responsibilities were defined. This was one reason the contract mattered so much. It was not merely symbolic. It carried genuine legal weight. Once the agreement was completed, the couple officially became husband and wife in the eyes of the law. Yet for many families, the most visible and memorable part still lay ahead: the wedding celebrations. Musicians would arrive, guests would gather, food would be prepared in enormous quantities. Relatives would travel from neighbouring towns and villages. After months of planning, discussion and preparation, the engagement journey was almost over. The formalities had been completed. The legal foundation had been secured. Now it was finally time for the celebration everyone had been waiting for. After months of family discussions, formal visits, negotiations, gift exchanges, and legal preparations, the long engagement process finally reached its destination: the wedding. For many Ottoman families, this was not merely a single event. It was a series of celebrations that could last several days, depending on local customs, family wealth, and regional traditions. The entire community often became involved. Relatives travelled from neighbouring villages and towns. Friends arrived carrying gifts and congratulations. Musicians prepared their instruments. Cooks worked tirelessly to prepare large quantities of food. For a brief moment, ordinary routines gave way to celebration. In cities such as Istanbul, Bursa, or Edirne, wealthy families could organize remarkably elaborate weddings. Processions moved through the streets. Fine clothing was displayed. Guests enjoyed generous feasts and entertainment. In smaller towns and villages, the celebrations were often simpler, but no less meaningful. The purpose remained the same: to publicly recognize the union of two families and to celebrate the beginning of a new household. The bride often became the center of attention. Her carefully prepared clothing, jewelry, and trousseau were displayed with pride. Items that had taken years to assemble were finally brought into the marriage. For her family, this moment carried powerful emotions. A daughter who had spent her entire life in one household was preparing to begin another. For the groom, the wedding marked the transition into new responsibilities. Marriage was not viewed merely as a personal achievement. It carried obligations. An Ottoman wedding feast was not simply a meal served after a ceremony. It was the main event. Long before guests remembered the details of the wedding contract or the exact words spoken during the celebrations, they remembered the feast. They remembered the dishes, the music, the crowds, and whether the host family had demonstrated the generosity expected of respectable people. In many ways, an Ottoman wedding was judged by its food. That may sound unfair. Then again, human beings have been evaluating major life events based on catering quality for thousands of years. Some traditions never disappear. Across the Ottoman Empire, from the bustling streets of Istanbul to small villages in Anatolia and the Balkans, weddings were among the largest social gatherings a family could organize. They brought together relatives, neighbours, business associates, religious figures, and sometimes complete strangers who somehow managed to appear whenever large quantities of free food became available. The scale depended largely on wealth. A village farmer might host a few dozen guests. A successful merchant could feed hundreds. Members of the Ottoman elite occasionally organised celebrations so enormous that they resembled public festivals rather than family events. Regardless of size, however, every family faced the same challenge: feed people well, very well. In Ottoman society, hospitality was considered a serious virtue. Guests were viewed as blessings, and generosity enhanced a family's reputation. A host who provided abundant food earned admiration. A host who allowed guests to leave hungry risked becoming the subject of neighbourhood conversations. And neighbourhood conversations had remarkable staying power. A failed feast could become local history. Preparation began long before the wedding day arrived. Families purchased animals for slaughter, collected spices, secured grain, and organised cooking equipment. In larger celebrations, professional cooks were hired. Massive copper cauldrons appeared. Temporary cooking areas were built. Helpers moved constantly between kitchens, courtyards, and storage rooms. The closer the wedding approached, the busier everything became. Relatives arrived carrying supplies. Neighbours offered assistance. Children ran through courtyards pretending to help, while mostly creating additional work. Meanwhile, the cooks focused on the task that mattered most: producing enough food to satisfy a crowd that seemed to grow larger every hour. As the wedding morning arrived, delicious aromas began drifting through the streets. Roasting meat, fresh bread, rice simmering with butter and spices, sweet pastries cooling on trays. Guests followed these scents toward the celebration like sailors navigating by a lighthouse, and once they arrived, they discovered that the feast was only beginning. Once the guests arrived and the celebrations officially began, the true stars of the wedding feast started making their appearance. The food. And there was a lot of it. Modern wedding guests might expect several courses, a buffet, or perhaps a carefully arranged menu. Ottoman wedding guests expected abundance. The goal was not merely to satisfy hunger. The goal was to ensure that every guest left convinced they had attended a truly memorable celebration. One of the most important dishes at almost any Ottoman feast was rice. Not the plain rice many people imagine today, but richly prepared pilaf cooked with butter, broth, spices, nuts, dried fruits, or pieces of meat. Ottoman cooks considered pilaf an art form. A skilled cook could build an entire reputation around preparing exceptional rice. This may sound excessive, but every civilization chooses its priorities. Some build monuments, others perfect rice. The Ottomans attempted both. Large platters of pilaf often occupied the centre of communal dining arrangements. Guests gathered around them, sharing meals in groups. Hospitality encouraged generosity, and hosts wanted everyone to eat well. Alongside the rice came soups, another cornerstone of Ottoman cuisine. Rich lentil soups, meat-based broths, and hearty stews appeared in enormous quantities. These dishes could feed large crowds efficiently while still providing warmth and flavour. In fact, soup was so important to Ottoman food culture that even elite households consumed it regularly. A wedding feast simply offered a much grander version. Bread accompanied nearly everything. Freshly baked loaves arrived constantly from ovens working throughout the day. Bread served both practical and social purposes. It filled stomachs, complemented other dishes, and ensured that even guests arriving late could find something satisfying to eat. Then came the meat. For many ordinary people in the empire, meat was not an everyday luxury. Weddings therefore provided a rare opportunity to enjoy large quantities of lamb, mutton, chicken, or beef. Roasted meats appeared on platters, stewed meats simmered in cauldrons, skewered meats cooked over open fires. The smell alone could attract attention from several streets away, and occasionally from neighbours who suddenly discovered a strong interest in maintaining friendly relations with the host family. As servants and helpers carried dish after dish through crowded courtyards, guests quickly realised something. This was only the beginning. Because while rice, soup, bread and meat formed the foundation of the feast, the Ottomans had no intention of stopping there. The most impressive dishes were still waiting to be served. If the rice, soup, and roasted meats formed the foundation of an Ottoman wedding feast, the next dishes were designed to accomplish something equally important. They were meant to impress. A wedding was one of the few opportunities a family had to demonstrate its prosperity to a large audience. Guests naturally noticed the quality of the food, the variety of dishes, and the generosity of the host. Families knew this. Their guests knew this. The neighbours definitely knew this. As a result, wedding feasts often included special dishes reserved for important occasions. One of the most admired was stuffed lamb. In wealthier households, entire lambs could be prepared with fillings of rice, nuts, spices, dried fruits, and herbs. The presentation alone created excitement. When such a dish appeared, conversations often paused as guests admired the effort involved. And in a society that appreciated culinary skill, admiration was almost as important as appetite. The Ottomans loved combining sweet and savoury flavours in ways that surprise many modern diners. Wedding guests might encounter meat cooked with apricots, raisins, figs, or plums. Cinnamon sometimes appeared in dishes where modern people would never expect to find it. To Ottoman cooks, these combinations represented sophistication. To some first-time guests, they probably represented confusion. Fortunately, confusion tends to disappear quickly when the food tastes good. Another popular feature of large feasts was the variety of stews. Huge copper cauldrons simmered throughout the day, producing rich dishes flavoured with onions, garlic, spices, and slow-cooked meat. These stews could feed enormous numbers of people while maintaining the rich flavours guests expected from a major celebration. The preparation required significant effort. Cooks often worked through the night before the feast. Assistants chopped vegetables, carried water, maintained fires, and stirred massive pots for hours. In the largest celebrations, entire teams coordinated the cooking operation. The kitchen sometimes resembled a military headquarters, except with fewer swords and considerably more onions. Guests also enjoyed seasonal specialties. Fresh vegetables, fruits, nuts, and local delicacies appeared depending on the region and time of year. A wedding in Anatolia might feature somewhat different dishes than a celebration in Syria, Egypt, or the Balkans, but the principle remained the same: abundance, variety, generosity. The feast was intended to make guests feel honoured, and as plate after plate continued arriving, most certainly did. Yet despite all the attention given to meat, rice, and elaborate main courses, everyone understood there was another part of the meal many guests anticipated even more eagerly: the sweets. Because no Ottoman wedding feast was complete without desserts capable of making an already satisfied guest somehow find room for another serving. By the time the main courses began disappearing from the tables, most guests should have been completely full. The problem was that Ottoman wedding hosts had absolutely no intention of stopping there. Now came the sweets, and refusing sweets at an Ottoman celebration was often much harder than refusing a second serving of meat. A polite guest might insist he could not possibly eat another bite. The host would politely insist that he absolutely could. This discussion could continue for quite some time. Desserts occupied a special place in Ottoman food culture. The empire inherited culinary traditions from Central Asia, Persia, the Arab world, Anatolia, and the Balkans, creating one of the richest dessert traditions anywhere in the early modern world. Wedding feasts provided the perfect opportunity to display it. One of the most beloved treats was baklava. Layer upon layer of delicate pastry surrounded chopped nuts and sweet syrup, creating a dessert so famous that centuries later, people are still arguing about who makes it best. Some debates never truly end. Large trays of baklava appeared at important celebrations, often cut into carefully shaped portions and distributed among guests. Wealthier families sometimes ordered enormous quantities to ensure nobody left disappointed. Then there was helva. Prepared in numerous varieties throughout the empire, helva could be made from flour, semolina, honey, sugar, butter, or nuts depending on local traditions. It appeared at weddings, religious celebrations, and family gatherings across Ottoman society. For many guests, no feast felt complete without it. Other sweets followed: fruit preserves, candied nuts, honey-soaked pastries, sweet cakes flavoured with rosewater or citrus, dried fruits imported from distant provinces. The variety itself became part of the spectacle. A wealthy host wanted guests to see abundance wherever they looked. Sugar represented luxury for much of Ottoman history, making elaborate desserts a visible sign of prosperity. When tables overflowed with sweets, guests understood the message immediately. This family had spared no expense. Children naturally benefited the most from this portion of the feast. While adults discussed marriages, politics, business, and family affairs, younger guests often focused on the dessert trays with remarkable concentration. Future generations may change technology, language, and fashion, but children locating sweets at public gatherings remains one of humanity's most consistent skills. As the dessert circulated through the crowd, conversation grew livelier. Guests relaxed, laughter spread, musicians prepared for the next phase of the celebration. Because the wedding feast was never only about eating, the food brought people together, the entertainment kept them there. And as evening approached, the sounds of music, singing and celebration began to take over from the clatter of dishes and serving trays. Once the feast had satisfied everyone's appetite, the wedding entered a new stage. Now it was time to entertain the guests. An Ottoman wedding was never designed to be a quiet gathering where people ate politely and went home early. These celebrations often lasted for hours, sometimes days, and required enough entertainment to keep hundreds of people engaged. Fortunately, the Ottomans excelled at public celebrations. Music formed the heart of the festivities. Musicians arrived carrying drums, flutes, lutes, tambourines, and various regional instruments. Depending on the location, guests might hear the powerful sound of the zurna, a piercing woodwind instrument capable of being heard across an entire neighbourhood, accompanied by large drums whose rhythm could be felt almost as much as heard. Quiet was not the objective. Making sure everyone knew a wedding was taking place certainly was. As the music began, the atmosphere transformed. Guests who had spent the feast discussing family matters suddenly found themselves clapping to the rhythm. Children danced freely. Young men gathered together in energetic group dances. Older guests smiled while pretending they had no interest in joining. Many eventually joined anyway. Traditional dances varied enormously across the Ottoman Empire. The empire stretched across 3 continents and included dozens of cultures, languages, and local customs. A wedding in Bosnia looked different from a wedding in Anatolia. A celebration in Syria differed from one in Albania or Greece. Yet music remained universal. Every community brought its own songs and dances to the occasion. Professional entertainers also appeared at wealthier weddings. Storytellers performed humorous tales, poets recited verses, musicians demonstrated their skills, acrobats occasionally entertained crowds with remarkable displays of balance and agility. Some imperial celebrations even included jugglers, animal performances, mock battles, and elaborate spectacles designed to impress visitors. The goal was simple: keep people talking about the wedding long after it ended. Laughter became an important part of the celebration. Friends teased one another. Relatives exchanged stories. Old family memories resurfaced. The wedding was one of the rare occasions when multiple generations gathered in the same place, creating opportunities for connection that might not happen again for years. Meanwhile, the bride and groom remained at the centre of attention. Every song, every dance, and every cheer ultimately celebrated their union. The feast had brought everyone together. The entertainment transformed the gathering into a celebration. And as the evening continued, the crowd kept growing. Because some of the most important guests were still arriving, guests whose presence mattered almost as much as the food itself. No matter how impressive the food was or how talented the musicians might be, an Ottoman wedding feast depended on one thing above all else: the guests. A wedding was not merely the union of 2 individuals. It was a public event that strengthened relationships, displayed social connections, and reinforced a family's place within the community. Who attended mattered, and who did not attend could matter even more. As guests continued arriving throughout the day, the host family carefully welcomed each one. Important relatives received special attention. Elder family members were shown respect. Community leaders, religious figures, successful merchants, and influential neighbours often occupied places of honour. Their presence added prestige to the celebration. A wedding attended by respected members of the community reflected positively on the families involved. In many Ottoman towns, invitations extended far beyond close relatives. Friends, business partners, neighbours, former associates, and distant cousins all found their way to the feast. And Ottoman families had a remarkable number of cousins. Some appeared to emerge from branches of the family tree nobody had examined for decades. Yet somehow they always arrived in time for dinner. Hospitality required that they be welcomed warmly. The larger the gathering, the greater the honour. This generosity served an important purpose. Weddings strengthened social bonds. Guests attended not only to celebrate, but also to demonstrate support for the newly formed household. Relationships were renewed, friendships were reinforced, business connections were maintained. A wedding could function as a social gathering, family reunion, and networking event all at once. The wealthier celebrations sometimes attracted government officials, military officers, prominent scholars, or members of the local elite. In the imperial capital, weddings involving important families occasionally became significant public events that drew attention far beyond the immediate circle of relatives. Ordinary weddings were naturally smaller, but the principle remained identical. People came together. Communities gathered. Connections were strengthened. The seating arrangements themselves often reflected social customs. Elders received respect. Honoured guests occupied prominent places. Younger attendees generally understood where they belonged, at least most of the time. Every large family gathering throughout history has contained at least one person determined to sit somewhere inappropriate. Human nature remains wonderfully consistent. As conversations filled the courtyards and halls, the wedding became more than a feast. It became a display of community itself. People who might not meet again for months shared food, stories, laughter, and memories. And for the host family, seeing so many guests gathered together was deeply satisfying. Because in Ottoman society, generosity was measured not only by what was served, it was measured by how many people came to enjoy it. While ordinary Ottoman families hosted impressive wedding feasts, the celebrations organised by the imperial court operated on an entirely different scale. These were not simply weddings, they were public spectacles. When members of the Ottoman dynasty married, the festivities could continue for days or even weeks. Entire sections of cities transformed into celebration grounds. Temporary structures appeared. Markets became crowded. Travellers arrived from distant provinces hoping to witness the events. The empire itself seemed to pause and join the party. One of the most famous examples occurred during the reign of Sultan Murad III in the late 16th century. The circumcision festival held for his son became one of the grandest celebrations in Ottoman history. Although not technically a wedding, it demonstrated the extraordinary scale of imperial feasting and entertainment. Thousands upon thousands of guests attended. Foreign ambassadors observed the festivities with amazement. Huge quantities of food were distributed to soldiers, officials, scholars, craftsmen, and ordinary citizens. For days, cooks worked almost continuously. Massive cauldrons lined the celebration grounds. Bread, rice, meat, sweets, and countless other dishes flowed through the city. The goal extended beyond hospitality. These celebrations displayed imperial power. The message was clear. The Ottoman dynasty possessed enough wealth and resources to feed enormous crowds, while simultaneously funding music, performances, and public spectacles. It was political theatre served alongside dinner. And unlike many political events, people generally left satisfied. Entertainment reached extraordinary levels as well. Acrobats performed daring feats, Wrestlers competed before cheering crowds. Storytellers entertained audiences for hours. Musicians played throughout the festivities. Fireworks illuminated the night sky in later centuries. Foreign visitors frequently recorded their astonishment at what they witnessed. Many had never seen celebrations on such a scale. Even the presentation of food became a spectacle. Servants carried enormous trays through crowded areas. Special dishes were prepared specifically for elite guests. The logistics alone required careful planning. Moving enough food to feed thousands of people without creating complete chaos was an achievement worthy of its own celebration. Fortunately, Ottoman administrators possessed considerable experience managing large operations. Empires tend to develop that skill. These grand events influenced wedding traditions throughout society. Wealthier families often imitated aspects of imperial celebrations whenever possible. Few could match the resources of the sultans. Many certainly tried. Yet regardless of whether a wedding took place in a palace or a village courtyard, one thing remained constant. The feast was about more than food. It was about generosity. And nowhere was that generosity more visible than in the tradition of feeding people far beyond the guest list itself. For many Ottoman families, the wedding feast was not limited to invited guests. In fact, one of the greatest signs of generosity was feeding people who had never received an invitation at all. This might seem unusual today. Modern weddings often involve carefully counted guest lists, assigned seating, and detailed calculations about how many meals need to be ordered. Ottoman celebrations frequently operated according to a different philosophy. If food remained available and hungry people were nearby, they should be fed. This attitude was especially visible during large weddings hosted by wealthy families, local notables, and members of the imperial elite. Huge quantities of food were prepared specifically because hosts expected more people to appear than originally planned. And they usually did. Neighbours stopped by. Travellers passed through. Poor families heard about the celebration. Curious spectators gathered near the festivities. Before long, the feast extended well beyond the original guest list. In Ottoman culture, hospitality carried both social and religious importance. Feeding others was considered a virtuous act. Weddings therefore became opportunities not only to celebrate a marriage, but also to demonstrate generosity toward the wider community. Large cauldrons of soup might be distributed to crowds. Bread could be handed out freely. Rice dishes and meat stews were sometimes prepared in such quantities that entire neighbourhoods benefited from the celebration. For poorer members of society, wedding feasts occasionally provided one of the best meals they would eat all year. This reality was particularly important in times and places where meat remained relatively expensive. A wedding might offer foods that many people rarely enjoyed in ordinary life. The host family gained respect. The community benefited. Everyone generally considered this a good arrangement. Of course, feeding large numbers of unexpected guests required careful planning. Cooks needed reserves. Servants needed organisation. Supplies needed to be abundant. Running out of food was one of the worst outcomes imaginable. Guests could forgive many things. An empty serving tray was much harder to overlook. The fear of this embarrassment encouraged hosts to prepare far more food than they believed necessary. Better to have leftovers than stories. Stories lasted for years. Food disappeared in minutes. This generosity also helped strengthen community relationships. People remembered which families treated others kindly during important occasions. Acts of hospitality created goodwill that often lasted long after the wedding ended. As the feast continued into the evening, guests, neighbours, and visitors all shared the same food and celebrations. The wedding had become something larger than a family event. It had become a community gathering. and as darkness approached, one final stage remained. The moment when the celebration began winding down and guests reflected on a feast they would remember for years to come. As the sun began to set and the final dishes disappeared from the serving tables, an Ottoman wedding feast entered its last stage. Not the end of the celebration, the end of the feast itself. Guests were still talking, musicians were still playing, and children were still finding surprising amounts of energy despite spending the entire day running through courtyards and chasing sweets. But gradually, people began preparing for departure. And this was the moment when a wedding's success became clear, not through official announcements, not through accounting records, but through conversation.